Thank you for coming this evening to our event, Conversations on Children and Permanency. I'm going to introduce now Head of School, Professor Deborah Hayes, and then we'll tell you about our program. Thank you.
Hello everyone, nice to see you all and thanks for coming. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I'd like to pay my respect to their elders, past, present and emerging. As the head of the Sydney School of Education and Social Work in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you here for Conversations on Children and Permanency. And thank you for taking your time to come. I know going somewhere at the end of a long day, it takes quite a bit of effort, quite a bit of organisation, and so we appreciate you coming. This evening our guests will be discussing the nature and complexity of relationships and kinship networks in the context of open adoption. Our international guest, Professor Harold Grotevant, or Hal as he prefers to be called, has travelled all the way from Amherst in Massachusetts. And I've just been having a delightful conversation with Hal about his research. Hal is the Rudd Family Foundation Chair in Adoption Research and continues to serve as the principal investigator on the Minnesota-Texas Adoption Research Project, or MTARP. This remarkable longitudinal study began in the mid-1980s and has followed adopted children from the time they were school age through adolescence as emerging adults and on to being young adults. And I was telling Hal that I thought I was quite proud of some longitudinal research I'd done over 3 years, but once I saw the length of his longitudinal study, I realised mine was fairly small, Becky's really. So for those of you who do not know the history of the Institute, that is the Institute of Open Adoption Studies, I'm sorry I've jumped. Let me go back. Found my page. The other speaker and the MC for the evening is Associate Professor Amy Conley Wright, Associate Professor of Social Work and Director of the Institute of Open Adoption Studies here at the University of Sydney. And we're very, very proud to have Amy and her colleagues based in the Sydney School of Education and Social Work. Amy will provide you with an overview of the program and will lead the discussion with Hal, exploring the importance of relationships to children's development and well-being. These relationships, as challenging as they can sometimes be, go to the heart of children's sense of identity and understanding of their place in the world. Research tells us that when adults put children's needs in the centre, it is possible to form rich and rewarding relationships between birth and adoptive families that can last a lifetime. So I now invite Amy to lead tonight's proceedings. Thanks, Amy.
Thank you very much, Deb, for that introduction, and I know you have to go now, so thank you for coming. And I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which the University of Sydney is built, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my deep respect to elders, past, present, and emerging. And always when we have these conversations about adoption, I think it's important to acknowledge the impact and harm caused to the First Nations people of Australia from past practices of child removal that have contributed to individual and collective trauma. And also to acknowledge the great wisdom that is part of Aboriginal kinship practices that have sustained, a living culture for 60,000 years, and how much we have to learn from those practices. So, thank you. I wanted to provide a little bit of background about the Institute before we start the proceedings. The Institute of Open Adoption Studies, for those of you who don't know, was established in 2016 from a grant from the New South Wales government of $2.6 million as part of a set of reforms that have been happening that emphasize permanency for children who will otherwise remain in long-term foster care and cannot be safely restored to their parents' care. The mission of the Institute of Open Adoption Studies is to build the evidence to inform practice and policy through our research with children young people and families with a focus on their rights to permanency, continued relationships, and connection to culture. And we do that through building research capacity and capability within out-of-home care and adoption, through fostering research collaborations across relevant disciplines. We have collaborations with academics in psychology, sociology, economics, and other fields, and law, very importantly law, our colleague. We conduct applied research to address the most pressing practice and policy issues. We develop tools and resources to support good practice, particularly in how do you build these relationships among children and their families, and reflecting the voice and the views of young people, children, young people and families that are affected by permanent removal. And I wanted to just comment, that adoption in Australia has a very difficult history. We won't be getting into the history of adoption in Australia as part of this presentation, but it's something that will be in our minds, I think, as we hear Hal speaking about the history of adoption in the United States. I just wanted to mention that we have prepared a video that's available on our website. We have resources that include multimedia resources that discusses the history of adoption, the past, present practices, and some considerations for the future. So I encourage you to have a look at that if you're interested in learning more about Australia's history of adoption. And as Deb mentioned, I'll give a little bit more detailed background about Hal. We are delighted to welcome Professor Hal Grotevant as our keynote speaker at our annual Institute of Open Adoption Studies Research to Practice Forum tomorrow, and our speaker for this evening. Hal holds the Rudd Family Foundation Chair of Psychology, and he'll tell us more about what that means in his talk, at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, where he is the founding director of the Rudd Adoption Research Program, which connects adoption research with policy and practice through conferences, workshops, graduate and postdoctoral training, and research activities. And his research focuses on the relationships in adoptive families, and particularly in open adoption, and on identity development in adolescents and young adults, and has resulted in over 150 articles and chapters, as well as several books, including Openness in Adoption, Exploring Family Connections, with his colleague, Dr. Ruth McCroy. Hal directs, which we'll hear more about this evening, the Minnesota-Texas Adoption Research Project, which again examines outcomes for adopted children whose families vary in terms of their contact with birth relatives. And this longitudinal research study, which was started in the mid-1980s with Ruth McCroy, has followed children and their families for 30 years into young adulthood. Hal is also a fellow of the American Psychological Association, the Association for Psychological Science, and the National Council on Family Relations, and the recipient of awards for research, teaching, mentoring, outreach, educational leadership, and adoption scholarship. So in a moment, I'll ask Hal to come to the podium and share with you his research. And I just wanted to mention our plans for the evening. So Hal will present on the findings of the MTARP study, and then we will begin a conversation about the study and his research. I have some questions to start, and then we will invite questions from the audience. We will have members of the staff from the Institute of Open Adoption Studies who will have index cards because we will be recording the event. So we'll be taking cards rather than directly from the audience. We'll take them on index cards. And also, following the discussion, we have a reception, which we hope you will stay and join us for some conversation with colleagues, with food and wine, which will follow at 6:30, so after the main proceedings. So thank you again, and I'm very pleased to welcome Hal now to speak to us.
Great. All right. Thank you very much, Amy, and thanks to all of you for your warm welcome here. This is my first visit to Sydney, and it's been a wonderful opportunity. I've had a great time getting to see your beautiful city and meet a number of people, and I'm just very happy to be here and happy to have the opportunity to share some of our work with you. So I want to make sure I've got the right. Good. All right. So I'd like to begin by talking just very briefly about our center at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, which was actually created through the generosity of a couple whose daughter was an undergraduate student at our university. They have 4 children, 2 by adoption and 2 by birth. And one of their adopted daughters was an undergraduate student in our department. And when she completed her degree, they wanted to do something to express their thanks to the university for the good experience that she had. And as adoptive parents, they knew that there were different times in their lives that they needed support of different kinds to help with parenting issues and trying to understand what their children were needing. But they knew as well-informed people that there were a lot of articles in books and journals and things like that, but that information had not been translated and put in the hands of practitioners and people who needed or could use that information. So they wanted to create an opportunity in a university-based center for new research to be conducted, but also with a special eye to dissemination, translation of that information. And so the Rudds are very actively involved with the university and with our center. They come to all of our conferences. I'm in, I would say fairly frequent contact with them, and their support has been wonderful, really wonderful. We just celebrated our 10th anniversary last year, and so this is our little birthday cake that we had at our conference in 2018. So among the different aspects of our mission, one is to advance knowledge about the psychology of adoption through original research. And today I'll be talking about the study illustrated on the left there, the Minnesota-Texas Adoption Research Study, but we have other databases that we also work from. One of our goals is to mentor the next generation of adoption competent researchers. And here you see pictures of some of our undergraduate, graduate, and postdoctoral students who've worked with us in recent years, in the past 10 years. We also engage with the community, with community partners to incubate and implement and evaluate programs that may be of broad interest to the community. On the left, you see an illustration of our adoption mentoring program. Here we have a partnership with Big Brothers Big Sisters in the local community, which is a major kind of mentoring organization that goes through the US. And we identify college students at the university who themselves were adopted and see if they would be interested in being mentors to children in the community, usually pre-adolescent, 8 to 12-year-old children in the community who are adopted, because many of those young children don't know anyone else who is adopted. And this way they get a chance to develop a relationship, see a role model, so that as they get older, it's like, yes, I knew this other person who was adopted and they succeeded, and so on. So it's been a very successful program, and I could talk to you more about it if you're interested. On the right, you see an illustration of the Treehouse community, which is an intergenerational, intentional community located near our town, where families who've adopted children from foster care live together in a community to help each other with their individual needs. But the unique part of it is that it's supported by elders who also live in this same community, most of whom have had families of their own. Their children are grown. Many of them are single women, and they live as part of this community support. And it's a very successful kind of endeavor. So we do a lot of work with the Treehouse community as well. Another part of our mission is to provide evidence-based knowledge to inform practice and policy. And here you see illustrations of Megan Gunner and Mary Dozier and Philip Fisher, all of whom have been keynote speakers at our conferences. We usually have a major conference each year. We also publish work on our website, and we after our 10th anniversary conference, we posted a series of 18 papers on the future of adoption, and they're all available from this website at no charge, and we would encourage you to look at them, download whatever you want, and use it in your practice. And I'd be happy to talk to you more about those as well. And then finally, one of our goals is to create an adoption-friendly campus at the university. So we teach undergraduate courses. I teach a course on the psychology of adoption. And starting next Wednesday, I'm teaching a new seminar on foster care. We also have research. We have undergraduate students who work in our research labs. We have a parent group for staff and faculty parents, adoptive and foster parents. And then we have several different groups for students on our campus who either have been adopted or who've experienced foster care. So our goal is really to make it kind of a welcoming community for people who have personal connections to adoption. So in today's presentation, I'd like first to talk briefly about adoption in the U.S. context, because I think it has some very interesting similarities and differences to that of here in Australia, but then also talk about some of the findings from our project, especially focusing on the developing relationships between adoptive and birth family members over time. So I want to begin by talking about a couple of milestones in U.S. adoption history, the first of which goes back to 1851, which was a time when actually in my state of Massachusetts, there was an act that was promulgated to provide for legal adoption. And really it came about as a humanitarian gesture, facilitated in many ways by charitable organizations who knew that there were children who needed families. There were many children at the time of the Industrial Revolution who were homeless, living on the streets, orphaned, and so on. And so this provided a legal framework for children to have permanent families. And the guiding principle behind this law was the best interest of the child, which is something that's continued certainly through time, with a gradual shift over time from providing children for families to providing families for children. A second aspect of our history that I'd like to mention is the orphan trains. So I mentioned that in the mid-1800s, there were a lot of children in major metropolitan areas on the East Coast, especially Boston, New York, and some of those major cities, who were often from large families where the families couldn't support them. Some of them were homeless, they were on the street, they had factory jobs, but they weren't always working. And so there were charitable organizations who decided for various reasons that rather than let these children suffer in the way they were, they would actually put them on trains and send them across the country to communities who needed children, often for labor on farms and in homes and things like that. So it was partly a humanitarian gesture toward the children, but as you can imagine, it was also fraught with other kinds of problems in terms of exploitation and things like that. So these were called the orphan trains. Children actually at stops, when the train stopped as they went westward, the children got out on the platform, and different families in the community might come and say, well, you can come live with us or whatever. And that's the origin of the phrase to be put up for adoption. And so that's a phrase that we try not to use, even though it's often used in common English parlance, but it harks back to the days of the orphan train when the children were literally put up on that platform. That movement started in the mid-1800s and actually continued until the early 1900s, but at that point the organized system of foster care was coming in and being developed, and at that point the orphan train stopped. But that's a part of our history that we're not particularly proud of, but it does kind of set the stage for what happened. As with the case here in Australia, there was a phase during which adoption was really shrouded by stigma and shame and secrecy across the entire adoption triad. So for young women who were pregnant outside of wedlock, there was a serious stigma associated with that. For the children of those women, there was stigma associated being with a child who didn't, whose parents were not married. And for adoptive parents who experienced infertility, there was stigma associated with that too. So partly because of all of those kind of negative views around family formation in terms of adoption, there was a lot of kind of negative tinge around it. And it led people to attempt to mimic biological families, or we call it a bionormative basis, by doing a couple things. One was matching of children, kind of the physical matching of children to their adoptive families. So the people who were placing children in families attempted to try to say, well, we think this child is going to be tall, so we're going to match them with a family where the parents are tall, or something like that. This matching went on so that basically they could pass as a biological member of that family. Birth certificates were altered at the time of adoption, so the names of the biological parents were taken off the birth certificate and the names of the adoptive parents were substituted, and then the records were sealed and put away. So there was a whole area, and I know this is very similar to some of the things that happened here in the era of forced adoptions. And these adoptions, I would say, they were not literally forced in terms of somebody, saying you must place your child for adoption, but these women were basically forced by circumstances because they found that, their family members didn't want to take them in. The social safety net in the United States was and still is very poor. So there were not a lot of social safety net programs available for people who were unemployed and having children. So that era kind of continued, and some children during that phase were never told that they were adopted. And we even today have a number of young people who are what we call late discovery adoptees. So these are young people who discover, perhaps at the time of their parents' passing, that they were actually adopted when they go through their parents' records and so on. So there is still a tinge of this associated, but really I think with many of the advances that came after the 60s and all of the human potential movements and so on, people are much more open to the idea of variations in families and so on. But that definitely had an influence on the history of adoption in the U.S. Another aspect of our past, which has some parallels here in Australia, is the passage of the Indian Child Welfare Act in 1978. So the Native Americans or American Indians, our indigenous population, many of those children up until the early 1970s had been forcibly removed from their native families because it was the judgment of the white population of social workers and professionals. It was their judgment that they were living in unacceptable circumstances, and so many of those children were removed from their homes and put in with white families or put in boarding schools where they were taught not to use their language and so on. 85% of these children who were taken were placed in non-Indian homes or institutions, including what we call the Indian boarding schools. And so this Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978 states that the Indian tribe, and in the U.S. the tribes are sovereign nations within the larger United States, that the tribe has jurisdiction over its children, and the children cannot be placed in non-Indian homes or institutions over the objection of the community. And this is a quote from the Act: "There is no resource that's more vital to the continued existence and integrity of Indian tribes than their children." So there's basically a separate process for dealing with child welfare issues in the indigenous population. This is a picture of one of the Indian boarding schools from Western New York, and you'll see all these children here whose hair was cut and who were wearing uniforms and so on. They were forbidden to speak their native language. And there is a link here. I don't have time to show it now, but there's actually a whole, if you Google it, you'll see there's a whole set of videos of testimonials of people who lived in that era and attended the boarding schools. Finally, today we have what I call the adoption reform movement. So now we have a whole generation of young adults who have come up through adoption who feel that there's much more work that needs to be done to reform the system. Some of them are birth parents who placed children for adoption or who felt they had no choice but to do that. And they have a group called Concerned United Birth Parents, which is very actively involved in advocating for their needs. And then young adults themselves, whether they've been adopted domestically or internationally, are also becoming very vocal about what they experienced and what they feel the important needs and gaps are for services to adopted persons. And for, okay, I don't know how to go back. Oh, here we go. So for more information, there's actually a website called the Adoption History Project, which has a lot of documents and good information, and a good edited volume by Wayne Karp called Adoption in America. So in the US today, our population is about 327 million, and there are roughly 1.5 million adopted children under the age of 18 in the US. As is the situation here in Australia, we have states that comprise our federal government, and the states prize their autonomy. And so because adoption law is family law, and that's determined at the state level, there are different practices and different laws that govern what happens in different states, although there are some overarching federal statutes as well. For example, the Indian Child Welfare Act, that's a federal statute. Just to give you an idea of our foster care situation, we currently have about almost 450,000 children in foster care in the US. Average age is about 8.5, roughly half males and females, and 56% of the children are non-white. And so this means that there's an overrepresentation, especially of African American children, in the child welfare system. Typically, they're in care for about 20 months. Currently, 123,000 children are awaiting adoption. So this means that because of certain timeframes that have been put in place to prevent the opportunity for children to be in foster care and going from one home to another for year and year and year on end, at some point, the first priority is always family reunification. But if it's clear that that's not going to work out within a time frame of about 2 years, the court can terminate the parental rights and make it possible for those children to be adopted. So currently there are 123,000 children in that situation, and about half of them will be adopted during any year. The number of children in care and awaiting adoption has been rising over the past 5 years, partly because of the opioid epidemic, which is going through our country and causing a lot of issues with chemical dependency and maltreatment and so on. Currently in the US, we have 3 types of adoption: domestic infant adoptions, which is kind of what I'm going to be talking about today, but these are placements of young children by women who basically feel that they cannot provide the kind of support for their children that they would like, and they make a plan for that child to be adopted. So it's about 14,000 a year. International adoption, about 4,000. This is down from 24,000. So at the peak, about 15 years ago, was 24,000 a year, and now it's dropped considerably, as it is all over the world, actually. And the type of adoption that's growing is from the child welfare system or through the foster care system. Currently, about 60,000 children a year are being adopted from care. We're moving from an old paradigm in which adoption is viewed as almost like a subtractive process of actually moving a child from one family, severing those parental ties, and moving them to another family, to a new paradigm in which we talk about an adoptive kinship network, in which there's a permanent connection made between the adoptive and birth families, with the child kind of at the center. And even if they don't know each other and all the family members don't know each other, the connection is a psychological one. So it's clear that that child knows that they are adopted, that they have birth family, that they have a birth history, and that they also acknowledge that they have an adoptive family. So that's kind of the way the paradigm has been shifting over the past 20 or 30 years. This movement has occurred partly because of what I call a perfect storm of things happening, that there were people at private adoption agencies in the 70s and 80s who were beginning to think that this might be a good idea So they were beginning to experiment with allowing and permitting and encouraging contact between adoptive and birth family members, but partly it was because of what was going on in the broader population. There were fewer babies to place, yet a high demand for adoption. Birth mothers were less willing to lose all knowledge of their children, and there was an evolving view that contact may be in the best interest of the child. So that's kind of where we came into this, is to kind of see how are these things actually working out. So I'm going to skip just a little bit here and say, in a typical domestic infant adoption, the birth parent or parents, usually the birth mother, is involved in selecting the adoptive family with the agency assistance. There is direct contact typically between the birth family and adoptive family members. They often signed a post-adoption contact agreement or post-adoption communication agreement, which kind of specifies the kind of contact that they hope to have. Some of these agreements are legally binding in some states, but not in others. So for example, in Massachusetts, it is legally binding, and if one party or the other kind of does not keep their agreement, that can be taken to mediation, and then the mediator helps to try to figure out what happened and what to do about it, but it cannot undo the adoption. But the day-to-day dynamics of the family are worked out by the participants with relatively little professional support. So once the adoption is finalized and everything, it's really up to the family members to kind of figure that out. Although there are some post-adoption services that are available, but they're not widespread. It really depends partly on where you live and how available they are. But nevertheless, the adoptive parents are the legal parents and have the full legal parenting rights and responsibility for their child. The contacts in open adoption may include meetings, phone calls, social media, exchange of pictures, gifts, letters, emails, and so on. It may involve a variety of people. It may just involve birth and adoptive parents, but it may involve extended family members and siblings and so on. It may vary in frequency. So we have some families where they only see each other quite rarely, and others where they see each other, several times a month, depending on the kind of relationships that they've forged over time. Some of them have verbal or written agreements about their contact, but one thing we know for sure is that the contact will change over time. So as children change, as families change, circumstances change, people move, people enter the family, people leave the family, things do change. There were some initial concerns about openness that really inspired our research. One of the concerns was about children, because again, we're coming out of this era of secrecy and shame and stigma and so on. And one of the concerns was that the children, if they had contact with their birth parents, they would be confused about who their real parents were. They wouldn't understand, they wouldn't be able to distinguish, they wouldn't understand how that worked, and that could lead to issues with self-esteem, identity, mental health, and so on. With the adoptive parents, concerns were that they would continually feel intruded upon or lacking the sense of entitlement to be the child's full parents. And with birth parents, that they would continue to feel unresolved grief and that they would not be able to kind of get on with their lives. And I can kind of fast forward to the end just to give you the punchline for this. And in our research, we have found support for none of these things. We have found support for none of these. In other words, the children in open adoptions are not confused. The adoptive parents do not feel that that they're not the full parents. And birth parents actually in open adoptions often feel less unresolved grief. So I'll elaborate on more of those, but I just wanted to give you the little end of the story quickly. Of course, there are additional concerns about children adopted through the child welfare system from care, and that includes safety risks for the possibility of re-traumatization or re-experience of maltreatment. For the adoptive parents, the concerns about intrusion may seem more acute. And for birth parents, there may be even more acute feelings of anger or shame or guilt, especially if their placements were contested. So it brings us to our study here, and I want to make sure I'm doing okay on time. Okay. So this is a project that I began with my colleague Ruth McCroy in the mid-1980s. The children in our study were born in the late 70s and early 80s. We call it the Minnesota-Texas Project because those are the universities that we were at during the early phases of our project. But the families are really drawn from all over the United States. And we had two large overarching questions. The first was, what are the links between these openness arrangements and psychosocial outcomes for the adopted children, adopted parents, and birth parents? And the second one was, how are relationships managed over time? And in today's presentation, I'm going to focus on the second question primarily, but I'll be around, this evening. We'll be happy to talk about other issues as well. I want to acknowledge members of our research team. Here we have a wonderful, really one of the privileges of working on a project like this over so many years is that you just work with wonderful colleagues and students and practitioners, and that's really been a joy. It's been wonderful to work with Ruth for all of these years. I was telling someone she just retired for the second time. So she retired once from the University of Texas, then she moved to California, and then Boston College contacted her about doing some consulting there, and they kind of liked each other, and then they invited her to stay on full time, which she did, and she just retired from Boston College. So she's one of those few people who retires multiple times. But anyway, she assures me that that's it. But we have great colleagues on the project, and we've been very fortunate to have funding from a number of different federal and private sources that have allowed us to keep the project going. And I think we'll talk more about that a little bit later. Participants in our study, we have 190. We started with 190 adoptive couples. These were heterosexual married couples, mostly white, middle to upper middle class, average age about 40 at the time that their children were in middle childhood. We focused on one target child per family, and the children, when they started, were in middle childhood. We wanted to start the study when the kids were old enough for us to actually interview. So we had earlier done a pilot study, but all the children were infants. It's kind of hard to interview them, so we wanted to get them when they were a little bit older. But all of these children were placed as infants. The average age of placement was 4 weeks. Many of them were placed right out of the hospital into the adoptive family. There were no transracial or international or special needs adoptions, not because we weren't interested in those, but because our primary interest was in contact. And the more layers that you add of complexity of multiracial children, international adoption, and so on, the more challenging it is to draw conclusions about what you're interested in. We also had 169 birth mothers in the study who averaged age of 19 at their time of wave 1. And so this was not really a group of young teenage mothers. These were younger women. Many of them were late adolescent or young adults, but they decided to make an adoption plan because they felt they did not have the support they needed from their family or their community to provide the kind of family that they wanted for their child. Many of them wanted their child to grow up in a two-parent family, and most of them were not married or had a partner at the time. So, excuse me just 1 second. So at our first wave, as I said, we had kind of a mix of different degrees of openness. So we had about a third of our sample were in what we call confidential adoptions. In other words, they were closed adoptions where the adoptive and birth family members did not know each other personally and did not have identifying information about each other. We had a second group, the mediated adoptions, where there is communication that goes back and forth through the agency, where the agency may remove identifying information before it passes letters or information on to the other party. And then we had about a third of our sample were fully disclosed open adoptions. In other words, where they knew each other and they knew how to reach each other and have personal direct contact. So that's kind of how they started. These are the 4 time points at which we saw our families: middle childhood, adolescence, emerging adulthood, and young adulthood. So I'll talk a little bit about each of these. I'm going to kind of fast forward. Whoop. Fast forward too fast. Here we go. So the first kind of epoch I'd like to talk about is the phase from placement to middle childhood. And I call this figuring out the relationship dance, because here we have these adoptive parents and usually the birth mother, but sometimes other birth relatives. And part of what they need to do is figure out how they're going to do this dance together. How are they going to relate to each other? The families in our study are really what I consider to be pioneers in this, because, again, they were ones who adopted in the late 70s and early 80s, in which this was not commonly practiced. There were no guidebooks, there were no manuals, there were no websites, there were no, they really had to figure it out on their own with the assistance of people at the agency, but the agency people also were, kind of doing it for the first time. So they had to figure out this relationship dance. So what are they thinking? Well, first of all, we have to think about what's going on for the adopted parents as they're thinking about this new relationship. Do they acknowledge the child's dual connection to both their adoptive and birth family? And what does it mean for them to be in a relationship with the child's other mother? And one thing that we've seen really, I believe the relationship that develops between the adoptive mother and the birth mother is really critical. It really is critical for how that whole thing proceeds. They each have distinctive roles in the child's life, but they have to be able to figure out, the adoptive mother has to be able to figure out, what does it mean that the child's biological mother is also involved? And the birth mother has to figure out, what does it mean that this other woman is actually parenting my child day to day? They have to kind of sort that out. And again, it's done very individually, but it's kind of understanding how they think about this is an important aspect of what will guide what happens as the relationships proceed. So I want to give you a couple of contrasting quotes. So here's a quote from an adoptive mother in which there was no contact going between her family and the child's birth mother. And she said, "My job is to protect my daughter and do what is best for her and give her the most stable, normal life there is. My goal is that she would never feel any different or think of herself any differently than Joey, who is their older biological son. This gives a level of normalcy, stability, unity, and cohesiveness that I'm very quick to defend and very protective over." So when you think about her acknowledgement of this dual connection, we don't really see it there, right? I mean, she's really saying, my job is to be the full parent to this child, to protect her, keep her normal, and so on. But then we have a contrasting quote from an adoptive mom who is in frequent contact with the child's birth mother. And she says, "To me, when you're going into adoption, you have to be willing to accept the fact that the biological parents are in the picture. And if they're not in the picture, you wouldn't have a child. That's just the bottom line. And to recognize that, and that they have rights too, to know their child is alive and well and healthy and being taken care of." So a very different kind of framework for thinking about what that relationship is going to be like. We also have to ask, what are birth parents thinking here? Have they accepted the finality of the placement? How might their sense of loss or anger or shame or guilt influence their positioning as they interact with the adoptive family? And what does it mean for them to be in this relationship with the child's other mother? Part of what they have to do is figure out how to regulate emotional distance within the family. And we have a chapter that we wrote on this idea of emotional distance regulation. And if you think about any kind of new relational situation in which you're involved in the workplace, in a family situation, meeting new people, you know, sometimes there are people that you really want to get to know. You know, you see them, you think, oh, I could have a relationship with this person. I'd like to get to know them more. I'm going to disclose a little bit more about myself to them and so on. And it evolves in a nice kind of way. And there are other people that you meet, it's like, well, maybe we'll just kind of see each other every now and then. Or, you know, so people do this relational dance, and it's part of what goes on in adoption as well. So we talk about the idea of people having a comfort zone of interaction and having a range of tolerance for separation and connection. But this then plays out in the context of adoption, and it often pulls the adults out of their comfort zone, partly because there's no model for this, but also partly because it's just like regular relationships that we all have. In some relationships, you develop more closeness, more connection, and in others, it's a little bit less so. Here's a quote from an adoptive mother that really illustrates this process quite nicely. She said, and she's talking about the child's birth mother, "We used to write daily and call each other weekly in the beginning. When the children were real little, it was tremendous intensity. And I think as our birth mother became more secure in herself and went on to finish college, her need to see them once a week or once a month became less and less. And you know, she feels more comfortable with us, we feel more comfortable with her, and we just know that we always have access. You just take it one day at a time. If you want it to work, you'll work at it. We feel it's healthy and we want it to work because of our children." So here's an example of this process just unfolding kind of right before your eyes, really. One thing we did look at was the idea of fear of reclaiming, because one of the concerns that people had in the beginning of this era was that adoptive parents would always be concerned that the birth parents were going to come and try to take the child away. And the initial concern was that it was in the open adoptions that would happen, because the birth parents would know where the child is. And there's the old story about the adoptive parents being afraid to take their child to the shopping mall because the birth mother might be hiding behind a potted plant, you know, and jump out and take their child or something like that. But what we found actually was quite the opposite, was that the least fear of reclaiming was in the open adoptions, because they had developed a personal relationship. And many of the adoptive and birth parents had actually talked to each other about this and discussed that, like, why would I want to do that? You know, you're parenting my child, and so on. The most fear was in the closed adoptions, where the adoptive parents' ideas about birth parents were based on stereotypes and typically based on horror stories that had appeared in the media. You know, and there are always one or two stories about some horrible thing happening, and that's what would drive people in the absence of having a personal relationship. We also found that there were divergent needs for contact, that adoptive parents initially wanted to kind of establish some boundaries of their own family. You know, like here we finally have a child, we want to have some boundaries here, but then as they become more confident, they're willing to kind of relax that a little bit and be a little more open to new people coming in. Whereas the birth parents at the beginning were feeling more uncertain, more worried. How's my child doing? In the case of these adoptions, since they were placed by the birth mother, did I make the right decision? Am I regretting this? And so on. But it's a poignant kind of thing, because these pathways are going in opposite directions. At the time, the birth parents are needing the most reassurance. The adoptive parents are feeling the need to be more, have more boundaries, and vice versa. But if you're aware of this pattern, then you can normalize it and understand what's going on. We did see that, of course, there were a number of benefits of contact, and I know this is also becoming revealed in a lot of the research that's occurring here now. The children know the truth about their situation. They have access to ongoing information, especially about health. There's a larger circle of, a larger family circle of love and caring, and contact can be normalized from an early age. So this is kind of the early stage, but then kids hit adolescence, right? So the plot thickens a bit. And of course, adolescents, their mantra is, I don't want to be different. I don't want to be different. They want to feel normal. We had many teenagers we interviewed, they use that word normal. They just want to feel normal. They want their family to be normal. They don't want to be different. And they're very busy. They're busy with their friends. They're busy with school. They're busy with activities. And they're becoming more independent and have minds of their own about what they want to be doing with their time. And parental sensitivity is needed even, regardless of the fact of adoption. But the teen years can be difficult and can be challenging. We asked our young people during adolescence where adoption fit into their life. We asked them to rank order 6 different areas in terms of how important they were to them. Their occupational future, their friendships, their ideas about religion or spirituality, their health, their thinking about family in the future, and adoption. Where do you think adoption fit in for them? Dead last. Dead last. Those of us who are in the adoption field, we're thinking about adoption all the time and how important it is and everything. But for these teenagers, adoption was the least of what's on their mind. And here you see we've got rank 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, with rank 6 being the lowest priority. And you see that's 87 out of 149. So it's about 60% of the adolescents ranked at dead last, and another 20% ranked at 5th out of 6. So adoption is not what's really kind of on their mind. And the thing that they rank number 1, friends. They're friends. But there are 2 important things I want to note about adoption connections with teens. The first, we asked them, if you could ask your birth parents any 3 questions, what would you ask them? And the main thing that the teenagers wanted to know was why. Why was I placed for adoption? Now, of course, they all know why at one level. They all have a story. They all have a narrative. Typically, their parents have been talking about it since they were babies. They all know why, but they want to know really why. Really why. Why? What was going on then? And behind it all is really, did you love me? Did you love me, or did you reject me? That's really what they want to know, is what was that dynamic? What was that relationship like? The other thing that we realize, and it's important to note, is that family events during the adolescent years provide opportunities and situations for figuring out who's in the family and what does that really mean. Graduations are a big thing. Who gets invited to the graduation? Weddings are a big thing. Oftentimes the birth mothers may be getting married at some point, so it's like, does she invite her child to be in the wedding party, or something like that. So figuring out this new kind of complex family dynamic is something that gets sorted out, especially around holidays, graduations, and weddings. Here are a couple of illustrations of challenges we saw in contact. One was uncomfortable meetings. So here we're interviewing a teenager. The interviewer said, and where did the meeting take place? Well, at the mall. I think it was a pizza place and we were just eating. And was that an arranged meeting, or did you just run into her, meaning the birth mother? It was arranged. Okay, and what happened at the meeting? Well, we talked and I felt really uncomfortable. What do you think made you feel uncomfortable? Well, I don't know. She cried and she was hugging me and it was just weird. More than you'd like to have it? Yes. So teenagers don't like to feel weird. So it was an uncomfortable kind of meeting, uncomfortable kind of process. So that happened occasionally. We also saw that there were some challenges with letter exchanges. So here's a teenager. How do you feel about receiving or not receiving letters from your birth parents? Well, I have no problem receiving them. It's sending them that I have a problem with because I don't know what to say. I don't know what she expects me to say. I don't know the impression I'm giving from the letter because I know the impression I'm trying to give, but it's not always there because it's a letter and you don't get to hear the sound of your own voice. So, I mean, put yourself in the shoes of a 14-year-old or a 15-year-old trying to write a letter to their birth mother. What do I say? How do I say that? I can't hear my voice. Another big one for teenagers is the idea of inconsistency and broken promises. So here's a question that was posed. If you could ask your birth parents 3 questions, what would they be? Well, I'd ask my dad why he did that. Because I called, meaning birth dad, because I called him on the phone and he said, all right, I'll give you a call tomorrow. And he never did. I'd ask him why he did that, why my mom doesn't call anymore and never writes to me, really. Kids are very attuned. They have a radar for things, with inconsistency and broken promises. We had some cases where there was contact that faded away. So here's the same question. So here were is what was said. Why don't you spend more time with me? Am I very important in your life? If you ever met me, would you still remember me or would you forget me? Again, the child wanting that reassurance that they were important to their birth relatives. Is that your birth father that you direct that to or your birth mother? Both. And we also had some teenagers who acknowledged the extra relational work that's involved in extended contact. Here's a teen saying, it's just been like such an awesome experience, okay? And like hard. I guess, at times, you always have to, consider everyone else's feelings too. So it is a more complex kind of dynamic, and the teenagers are sensing that. But, as I think you can see from a lot of these quotes, it's really made them think deeply about these relationships in a way that other children may never have the opportunity to do. What does it take to make contact work? It takes adult commitment to keeping promises. It takes sensitivity to the preferences of the child. It takes the realization that the teenage years can be tough in any case, and that contact may make teenagers feel different and not normal. And so, just parents being sensitive and aware of all those things. But then if all things work out well, we move beyond the adolescent years to what we call emerging adulthood, which are those years between about 18 and the late 20s. So it's kind of that phase where they're definitely not children or adolescents anymore, but they're not fully independent either. So they kind of have a foot in both worlds. The pictures here are of our college student mentors who are involved in mentoring program. So here are these young adults who are, happy and doing great and everything, but they're still dealing with some of the insecurities about being college students and figuring out what they're going to do with their lives and so on. It's a time of identity exploration, but also some uncertainty. Okay, I think I mentioned these things. So in terms of that and adoption, the main questions they had, as opposed to the teenagers who wanted to know why, the young adults want to know more about medical and health background information, because some of them now are beginning to think about getting married, entering relationships, and maybe having children. But for many of them, they don't know anything or only very basic information about their health and medical and genetic backgrounds. So that's what this age group wants to know. And again, a few quotes here. Here's a quote from a young adult with no contact who wanted this information. So they said, I would like to have a little more medical history. I'm just more curious more than anything, especially now that I have a child. I'm not quite sure I'm ready to involve her, meaning my birth mother, in my life with my child. Here's another one where there had been contacted, but that faded away. The communication just stopped. I'm guessing my birth mother moved, or she got busy with her 3 kids. I don't have time to think about where she is, or should I contact her? So now this is at a time when the adoptive parents have typically turned over the control of the contact to the emerging adult, to the young person. And so now they're having to make a decision. Am I going to keep on with this, or kind of let it fade away and see what happens? Here's a case of the contact that wasn't working out. My adoptive mother felt that my birth mother was intruding, and I believe she felt threatened. The only reason I'm not pursuing a relationship with my birth mother right now is out of respect for the mother that raised me. So again, these children are often very aware of relational dynamics and sometimes are trying to protect one parent or the other in this contact. I'm going to skip one here. This was a challenge in negotiating increased contact. The young adult said, she's trying too hard. She, meaning the birth mother, is trying too hard. I wanted to find her to say thank you for giving me life. I was glad to meet her, but I'm not ready to make her part of the family. I wanted to find her, and I had good reasons for it. I just wish that someone could have helped me to know what might possibly happen after I found her and help me work through it. And again, there can be different expectations, because maybe it is that the young person really, they want to know, they want to meet the birth relatives, they want to have some understanding of them, but they're not necessarily seeking a deep relationship because they have parents, they have their adoptive family, whereas the birth parents may or may not be seeking more of a close relationship. So how do you match those up? How do you get those expectations aligned? A couple of dynamic things here. The adoptive parents typically step back, as I mentioned. One thing we found was that the young adults' partners also begin to have a say in this. So as they are thinking about getting married or they're in a relationship, we had some, especially of the young men, the young guys who'd been adopted, who really had relatively less interest in their birth families. They were going to be getting married, and their girlfriend or their fiance said, "What do you mean you don't know anything about your birth relatives? How can I marry you if you don't even know who these people are?" So sometimes their interest was actually stimulated by a conversation with a prospective partner. The other thing that happens at this phase is about grandparents, because as children are born, the adopted young adult has both their adoptive parents, who are now becoming grandparents, but also birth parents who are becoming birth grandparents. So what are the dynamics between the birth and adoptive grandparents in terms of how they interact, who has contact with their grandchild, and so on? But then the partner, who's typically not adopted, that partner also has parents who are becoming grandparents. So the family becomes more complex, and they have to kind of sort that all out. So then finally we move into young adulthood, and I'm just about wrapping up here. This is from the 20s to the 30s, and basically what I want to do here is just give you a couple of quotes, but highlight the fact that even though we think of young adulthood as a time of greater independence, we're finding that these young adults are still strongly connected to their families. Many of them have some financial support, but more emotional support. And so the idea that kids kind of leave home at 18 or leave home at 21 and then they're launched and independent is really just not what we have found. They're enduring connections, and of course that's what we want as we talk about permanence for children too. A couple of quotes. I feel loved by my birth mother, who made the decision to give me and my brother up for adoption because she couldn't give us the life she wanted, and loved by adoptive parents because they chose us for life. And I'm going to skip ahead to one really amazing quote from a young woman who's 27. She says, "I feel adoption has given me a lot, a complete sense of perspective that not a lot of children and young adults, or adults have for that matter. It's allowed me to be completely accepting of others' families and be able to see issues within families that I wouldn't have normally been aware of, or really even cared about. I like the viewpoint it gives me. So you really see the way these young adults, because of growing up in these complex families, have much more nuanced ideas about family. So I think what I'm going to do actually is stop here and thank you. And I know that Amy and I are now going to have some conversation that will pick up on some of these points and continue other things. But thank you for your attention.
Yes, yeah. Well, thank you very much, Hal. You've given us a lot to think about, and as you said, we'll start to unpack this. You know, we won't, and I want to make sure that we take some questions, because I'm sure that people here will want to ask questions and make comments. And I see Betty in the back and Suzanne. So if you would like to ask a question, if you could just raise your hand, they'll come around with an index card. So we'll kind of look for those as we start having some discussion. But I think one place to start would be talking about our trends here in Australia and forms of adoption here in Australia, where some of what's happening now in adoption parallels what's happening in the U.S., where adoption at birth here is quite rare.
Right.
Intercountry adoptions have also fallen off, as they have, as you said, around the world. And so the area where there's more adoptions occurring now are from out-of-home care.
Yes.
So the MTARP study focuses on adoptions that occurred at birth.
Yes.
And things are different in terms of adoptions from out-of-home care, including you talked about adoption contact plans, which can happen when infants are adopted through local adoption, but that's not a general practice in out-of-home care adoptions in the U.S. So maybe you could speak about, sort of elaborate on out-of-home care adoptions and where you see there sort of are parallels and where there might be some differences from your research.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, actually, in some of the out-of-care adoptions, they are beginning to do more in terms of written kind of plans and so on. Typically, what happens is that the adoptions are often kind of brokered by the Department of Children and Families, which is the state agency that's in charge of the children when they're in foster care. And once it's determined that a child, you know, the first emphasis in foster care is on family reunification. So the idea is that the hope is that these children will be brought back together with their families, and attempts are made to provide services to the parents and other family members to help them with whatever issues they might be encountering, whether it be chemical dependency or anger management or whatever those things might be. But for some of those children, if things have gone beyond a certain point in time and it's clear that the child will not be able to go back to their family, then the court may terminate the parental rights of those parents, and then an adoptive placement is sought for those children. One of the challenges in the U.S., because the adoptions are often done at the level of the state, but is that sometimes finding families who are interested and available to adopt a child is really difficult because of proximity. And so there are now national photo listings and exchange services that make it possible for people all over the country to see if their children. So, for example, Massachusetts is at the western part of the state where I live is actually closer to New York than it is to Boston. And so, but just because of geography, you know, people in Massachusetts may only be looking within that state. But so there are state photo listings of children who are legally available for adoption, and there are attempts to try to match them with families who might be interested in adopting them. So there are photo listings and things like that that are trying, you know, that are attempting to speed up that process of finding placements for children. But the idea of also the DCF, when they are trying to pull together a placement, they will typically work with the birth and adoptive parents to try to create a contact agreement about what that kind of contact might look like, what it might mean. The challenge, I think, as I know you encounter here as well, is how to build flexibility into those plans. Because the idea of creating a plan that is put in place when a child is, say, 5, that's going to continue until they're 18, you know, given what we know about how dynamic these relationships are and how much change occurs, it's really important to try to figure out how to build some flexibility in. So I think that's something everybody is struggling with, really.
Thank you. Another point that you raise is around the history of adoption, how adoption has changed over time, and some of the parallels that we have between adoption in Australia and the U.S. There have been challenges, you know, in the past. You know, the kind of example of Native American children and Indigenous children here in forced removal,
Right.
The issues around a sense of coercion, you know, where there was just no other option for women, and feeling pressured to give up their children. Issues around separation of children from their cultural identity in the context of intercountry adoption. So there's a lot of controversy in adoption. So if you could comment a little bit about the ethics of adoption and some of the issues that are raised around the ethics of adoption.
Yeah. Well, it's a small question. Yeah. I mean, I think when I think about it from that perspective, I mean, of course, since the beginning of time, there have always been situations where biological parents have not been able to raise their children for one reason or another. And so there have always been attempts to find community-based or other strategies for providing secure and safe homes for children. When I think about the ethics of adoption, my kind of touchstone really is the idea of the best interests of the child and the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child as a document really that embodies a lot of those principles for putting the child's best interests first. And I think that's a really important point of it. But one of the things that's happening now that adoption is kind of coming out of the shadows a bit, and there's much more talk about it and much more openness about it, is that the young people who've grown up through adoption, both the intercountry adoption, young adults, but also people who've been adopted from care, are becoming much more vocal about what they feel should be done or should have been done. So there is a very active critique about adoption practice and what that's like, but activism as well, a lot of activism. I would say especially on the part of the intercountry adoptions, the young adults now, especially from Korea, are now in their 30s, in their 40s, and many of them are becoming professionals in the field. Many of them are social workers, some of them are researchers, some of them are clinicians, and they are really being very vocal about especially the idea of the loss of culture, because for them, you know, they were brought from another country. In some of those cases, the adopted parents never actually even went to that country. The children were brought over and were raised without a lot of awareness of what it meant to be Korean or what it meant to be that nationality. And that worked when they were living at home. But then they go away to college or they go away into the broader world and they're regarded differently, and it's a shock, you know. So I think a lot of what's happening in the critique about adoption now is coming from people who've experienced adoption firsthand saying we need to do better.
Thank you.